Christianity has been called the greatest story ever told, but what if I told you that the entire foundation of this story rests on lies so massive, so carefully protected, that exposing them could shake everything you ever believed to its core, because the first lie is the claim that the Bible is historically accurate, a claim repeated from pulpits and seminaries for centuries. Yet when we look closer, when we peel back the layers of religious tradition, archaeology and history, the illusion crumbles, and we discover a patchwork of contradictions, fabrications, and myths stitched together to present the illusion of divine truth. So let us begin by dismantling the very idea that the Bible is a reliable historical record, because if the book is not history, if it is not truth, then what is it? And why has it been forced into your mind as if it were the unquestionable word of God? The shocking reality is that even Christian scholars admit that much of the Bible cannot be verified by historical evidence, that whole kingdoms described in the Old Testament show no sign of ever existing, that battles with supposedly hundreds of thousands of soldiers leave not a single trace in the archaeological record, and that entire genealogies contradict one another. For example, the conquest of Jericho described in the book of Joshua never happened the way it was told, because archaeologists have found that Jericho was not even a fortified city at the time the Hebrews supposedly marched around its walls. And yet from childhood, millions are taught that this story proves divine power, but it proves nothing more than human imagination and the ability of storytellers to shape belief. And then there is the story of the Exodus. Millions of Israelites wandering the desert for 40 years, yet where are the bones, the camps, the pottery, the massive evidence that should exist if millions of people lived and traveled together? The desert is silent, not a single trace, and yet entire. Religions have been built on the idea that God led his people out of Egypt with miracles and plagues. Is it not disturbing to realize that the central story of liberation in the Old Testament is a fabrication, an invention that became the backbone of identity for a people who never actually experienced it? And when you push further into the New Testament, the cracks widen, because even the birth of Jesus, supposedly the most important event in history, is told in completely contradictory ways. Matthew says he was born under King Herod. Luke says he was born when Quirinius was governor, but Herod died years before Quirinius ruled, which means these two accounts cannot both be true, and yet both are presented as gospel truth. How can they both be right if they contradict each other in their timelines? The uncomfortable answer is that neither is historically accurate, but rather both were attempts to retrofit Jesus into prophecies, to create a divine narrative where none existed. And if the very beginnings of the story do not align with history, what does that say about the rest of the narrative? Do you really believe that angels came to shepherds, that wise men followed a star like a GPS across the desert? Or do you see that these are mythological elements inserted to make a man look divine? And then we reach the Gospels themselves, written decades after the supposed events by unknown authors who never met Jesus, who borrowed from one another and from Old Testament scriptures, creating a recycled narrative dressed up as fact. Mark, the earliest gospel, does not even include the resurrection appearances. It ends abruptly with the empty tomb, while later writers, Matthew, Luke, and John, felt compelled to expand the story, to fill in the gaps. And in doing so, they contradicted one another at almost every turn. How can one gospel say there was one angel at the tomb, while another says there were two? How can one gospel say the women fled in fear and told no one while another says they immediately went and proclaimed the resurrection? These are not minor discrepancies. These are fatal fractures in the supposed accuracy of the story. And if the Bible truly were divinely inspired, would God have allowed such contradictions? Would an all-knowing creator have delivered his message through conflicting testimonies? Or is it more reasonable to conclude that human hands, human politics, and human imagination built this book? And let us not forget how many times this book has been rewritten, translated, altered, and manipulated. The Council of Nicaea deciding which texts would be included and which would be burned. Powerful men shaping the narrative not through divine inspiration but through political necessity. Do you really think the Romans who ruled with iron fists were interested in preserving truth, or were they more interested in controlling populations with stories that made obedience to authority look like obedience to God? The deeper you dig, the more clear it becomes. The Bible is not a history book. It is a mythological anthology, a carefully curated set of stories meant to inspire, to terrify, and to control. And this is the first lie that destroys Christianity, because once you admit the Bible is not historically accurate, the dominoes begin to fall. If Adam and Eve are not historical figures, then sin has no origin. If the Exodus never happened, then the God of liberation is nothing but a character in a story. If Jesus' birth accounts contradict themselves, then he is not the Messiah fulfilling prophecy, and suddenly the faith that billions were told is unshakable truth collapses into myth. You may feel a chill as you hear this, because it means that what you were told from childhood, what pastors preached from pulpits, what families prayed over at dinner tables, was never history, it was never fact, it was never real, it was story. And if it was story, then you must ask, who wanted you to believe it as fact? Who benefited from making you think God wrote these words? And when you realize that it was rulers, priests, and empires, suddenly you see the Bible not as a holy record, but as the most successful tool of propaganda the world has ever known. And that is why the first lie, the claim that the Bible is historically accurate, is the very foundation stone that must be shattered, because once it is gone, everything built upon it begins to fall. So when you hear people say the Bible is the Word of God, remember the silence of the desert, remember the missing evidence, remember the contradictions in the Gospels, remember the edits and councils, remember the manipulations of empires, and understand that the Word of God never looked so much like the word of men. This realization alone is enough to shake anyone awake, but it is only the beginning, because the next lies go even deeper, and when they are exposed, you will see not only that the book is false, but that the entire faith system built upon it was designed from the very start to control you rather than to free you. And so as we move forward, prepare yourself for what is coming, because the cracks in this so-called truth are about to become a chasm that swallows the entire story of Christianity. Now that the first lie has been exposed, that the Bible is not historically accurate, we must face the second and third lies, and these are the lies that pierce straight into the very heart of the Christian faith, the lies that Jesus physically existed as described, and that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, because if the man at the center of the story is not what the church claimed, then the entire system collapses like a house of cards. So let us begin with the claim that Jesus physically existed as described, because pastors, priests, and apologists repeat this with absolute certainty. Yet the evidence is not what they tell you. The truth is, there is not a single contemporary record of Jesus, not one. No Roman record, no Jewish record, no mention in government documents, nothing from historians who lived and wrote during the supposed lifetime of Jesus. And we are talking about an empire that kept meticulous records of taxes, trials, and executions. They recorded rebels. They recorded criminals. They recorded minor figures. And yet somehow the man who supposedly healed the sick, raised the dead, fed thousands, and stirred the masses, the man who supposedly entered Jerusalem to crowds crying Hosanna, left not a single trace in the historical record. Does that not make you pause? Does that not shake you to your core? Because the first time Jesus appears outside the Bible is decades later, and even then it is in disputed passages. Josephus, the Jewish historian, supposedly mentions him, but scholars know that the text was tampered with by Christian scribes. It was not the original writing, and Tacitus, the Roman historian, writing in the 2nd century, mentions Christians, not Jesus himself, and again it is decades removed. So when you are told that the evidence is overwhelming, you must ask, overwhelming where? Because the silence of contemporary sources speaks louder than any manipulated passage, and when we look at the Gospels themselves, the silence becomes deafening, because the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. Despite what Sunday school might have told you, none of the authors claim to have seen Jesus. None of them write in the style of direct observers. Instead, they write like storytellers, weaving together myths, prophecies, and borrowed traditions. The Gospel of Mark, the first to be written, came decades after the supposed crucifixion, and Mark does not say he was there. He writes like someone constructing a narrative to fulfill Old Testament prophecies. And then Matthew and Luke copy large portions of Mark, sometimes word for word, and yet they add their own contradictions. Luke says Jesus preached on a plain. Matthew says it was on a mountain. Matthew has Joseph and Mary living in Bethlehem. Luke says they came from Nazareth. And John, the last gospel written, is even more detached, filled with long speeches no one could have remembered word for word decades later. And yet Christians are told these are eyewitnesses, that Matthew was the tax collector, that John was the beloved disciple, but scholars know those names were added later to give credibility. The truth is, the Gospels were anonymous works. The names were attached centuries later by the Church. So if the man Jesus cannot be found in history, and the accounts of his life are anonymous, contradictory, and agenda-driven, then what are we left with? We are left with a story shaped by writers who never met the man, a story written in Greek by people far removed from the Jewish world Jesus supposedly inhabited, a story that looks far more like myth-making than reporting. And here is the unsettling thought you must wrestle with. What if Jesus never existed at all? What if the figure of Jesus was a synthesis, a myth built from earlier dying and rising gods, Osiris, Dionysus, Mithras, and dozens of others who share striking similarities? What if the man called Jesus was not a man, but a story constructed to embody certain ideals, to unite certain communities, to provide a divine figure around whom a religion could be organized? Imagine the shock of realizing that billions have devoted their lives, their prayers, their money, and even their wars to a character who may never have walked the earth. Imagine how deeply unsettling that truth is, but it is a truth that more and more scholars are daring to face. And yet, even if you grant for a moment that perhaps there was some man named Jesus, the fact remains that the Jesus of the Gospels, the miracle worker, the God made flesh, the resurrected one, is not history. He is literature, and the more you study the texts, the more obvious it becomes. The crucifixion narrative is patterned word for word on Old Testament passages, the Psalms, Isaiah, and others. The miracles echo earlier pagan myths. The teachings are a mixture of Jewish wisdom and Greek philosophy. This is not biography, this is myth-making. And when you understand that the Gospels were anonymous, works written decades later, borrowing from one another and from scriptures, shaped by communities desperate to make sense of their suffering under Roman rule, then you realize that these are not eyewitness accounts at all. They are theological propaganda, and the Church has lied to you by telling you otherwise. So the second and third lies collapse together, because if Jesus as described never physically existed, and if the Gospels are not eyewitness testimony, then what you are left with is a story without a foundation, a story that billions were taught to accept as history, but which in reality is nothing more than mythology disguised as fact. So think about this. If Jesus never existed as described, if the Gospels are anonymous works shaped decades later, then what exactly are people worshipping? Are they worshipping a man who never lived, or are they worshipping the power of a story that was designed to control them, to inspire obedience, to channel their loyalty to the Church and the Empire? And when you ask yourself that, you begin to see the terrifying reality that Christianity is not the preservation of historical truth, but the imposition of myth dressed as fact, that the Church has built an empire not on the existence of a savior, but on the effectiveness of a story. And that is why the second and third lies together strike at the very heart of faith. Because if the central character is questionable, if the sources are fabricated, then the faith itself has no anchor in reality. This is not an attack. It is simply the truth hidden in plain sight, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you know it, you cannot unknow it. And that is why millions who dare to study deeply, to question honestly, begin to leave the faith, because they realize that the story was never history. It was always myth, always propaganda, always designed to capture the human mind and heart with the illusion of divine truth. So as we move into the next lies, remember this: if the man at the center may not have existed as described, and if the books about him were not written by witnesses, then what follows about miracles, resurrections, and divine authority must be seen in an entirely new light, not as history, but as invention. And once you see that, you cannot go back. Now we arrive at the lie that Christianity itself hinges upon, the claim that the resurrection is a proven fact, the greatest miracle that supposedly sets Christianity apart from every other faith, the event that billions believe separates Jesus from all mythological figures before him. But here is the crushing truth: the resurrection is not a historical fact. It is a theological claim that crumbles under the weight of its own contradictions. Because when we look at the accounts of the resurrection, we do not find harmony, we find chaos. Mark's Gospel, the earliest, ends with the women fleeing from the tomb in fear and telling no one. There are no appearances of the risen Jesus at all. Yet Matthew adds appearances. Luke writes his own version. And John adds even more. None of them can agree on who went to the tomb, how many angels were present, what the women were told, or where Jesus appeared after rising, if this were a real historical event, the central miracle of human history. Would the accounts be so radically different if this were a proven fact? Would it not be documented clearly and consistently? Instead, what we see is the evolution of a myth, starting with silence in Mark, then growing with each retelling until it becomes a grand spectacle in John. This is not history unfolding. This is story building, myth creation, the development of a legend designed to convince followers that their faith was not in vain. And yet the church repeats over and over again that this is fact, this is history, this is undeniable. But if it were undeniable, why is the tomb empty in one gospel and filled with visions in another? Why does Paul, the earliest Christian writer, never mention an empty tomb? Why does he only refer to visions and revelations? Because Paul himself admits that his Jesus came through visions, not through historical encounter, which means that the resurrection, the very core of the faith, began not as history, but as visionary experience, as belief, as storytelling. And from that seed grew the third-day resurrection narrative that billions now accept as fact. But if the resurrection collapses, if this lie is exposed, then Christianity loses its central claim to uniqueness, because every religion can tell stories of miracles. Every culture can speak of gods who conquered death, Osiris in Egypt, Mithras in Rome, Dionysus in Greece. They all had their death and resurrection myths, and the Jesus story fits right into that pattern. It is not unique. It is recycled, it is borrowed, and yet Christians are told it is history. So when you realize that the resurrection is a fabrication, a theological construction, then you understand that Christianity is built not on truth, but on myth. And this brings us to the fifth lie, the lie that the church preserved the truth without corruption. Because if the resurrection narrative itself was manufactured, then who controlled it? Who shaped it? Who decided what version would survive? The answer is chilling. Powerful men in councils and cathedrals, bishops and emperors, men who fought and killed and exiled one another over which version of the story would be preserved, because the early centuries of Christianity were not unity, they were chaos. Dozens of gospels existed, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, and many others. Some said Jesus never died, some said his resurrection was spiritual, some said he was never human at all. The diversity of belief was staggering. And yet what happened to those voices? They were silenced, their writings destroyed, their communities branded as heretics, and the winners, the men aligned with empire, declared their version the truth. But was it really truth, or was it the most convenient version for Rome? Because by the time of Constantine, the church was no longer an underground movement, it was a tool of empire, and the Council of Nicaea and later councils systematically stripped away diversity, canonized certain texts, banned others, and declared that only their version was valid. This is not the preservation of truth. This is the consolidation of power, the corruption of faith into politics, the rewriting of history to serve emperors. So when you are told that the Bible was passed down faithfully, you must remember the burned scrolls, the destroyed libraries, the silenced heretics, the rewritten passages, the interpolations added by scribes, the fact that we do not even have the original manuscripts. Only copies of copies of copies, riddled with changes and edits. How can anyone call this preservation? It is corruption on a scale few dare to admit, and yet the church calls it holy. But holiness does not look like censorship. Holiness does not look like power grabs. Holiness does not look like emperors deciding which gospels live and which gospels die. This is not divine truth. It is political manipulation. And once you understand that the resurrection was not a fact but a story, and once you realize that the church did not preserve truth, but actively destroyed it to preserve its own power, you begin to see that Christianity is not a faith built on truth, but an institution built on lies. Lies repeated for centuries until they became tradition. Tradition mistaken for truth and truth replaced with myth. So when you next hear that the resurrection proves Christianity is true, ask yourself why the accounts contradict, why the earliest writer never mentioned an empty tomb, why the resurrection narratives fit neatly into older pagan myths. And when you next hear that the church has faithfully preserved truth, ask yourself why entire books were banned, why dissenters were slaughtered, why councils were necessary if God had already given perfect truth. The answer is inescapable. The resurrection is a lie, the preservation of truth is a lie, and with these exposed, Christianity's foundation shakes violently Because if the central miracle never happened, and if the church destroyed the evidence of its diversity, then the faith you were told was eternal truth is nothing more than a carefully constructed system of control, and that is why these two lies, the fourth and fifth, are devastating, because they strike not just at the story of Jesus, but at the very institution that claimed to guard his truth. And when you see this, you realize that the faith was not about truth at all. It was about obedience, about empire, about the manipulation of souls, and that realization should shake you to your core, because it means the trust of billions has been betrayed for centuries, and the world has been shaped by a lie dressed as salvation. Now we confront the sixth lie, one of the most cunning deceptions ever told, the lie that Christianity invented morality, that without this faith, humanity would have been lost in chaos and barbarism, that goodness, compassion, and justice only came to the world through the teachings of Jesus and his church. Yet history screams the opposite. Morality did not begin with Christianity. Morality is as old as humanity itself. Long before the first gospel was written, civilizations had already established codes of law, justice, and compassion. The Code of Hammurabi in ancient Babylon predates the Bible by over 1,000 years and already contains principles of justice, fairness, and protection of the weak. Egyptian texts spoke of ma'at, truth, balance, and order, urging people to live with honesty and kindness. Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle wrestled with ethics centuries before Christianity, and even Buddhism, Hinduism, and Confucianism had deep moral systems, without any reference to Jesus. So why then does the church claim that morality came from them? Because if they could convince you that morality began with Christianity, then they could convince you that abandoning Christianity means abandoning morality itself, that without them you would be lost, sinful, corrupt. But this is manipulation. Morality comes from empathy, from human society, from shared survival, not from a book or a church. And in fact, when we look at the history of Christianity, we see that the church has often stood against morality, not for it. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the persecution of scientists like Galileo, the witch hunts, the forced conversions, the burning of heretics. These were not acts of morality, they were acts of power, and yet they were justified in the name of God. How then can anyone say Christianity invented morality when it has so often twisted morality for its own ends? The truth is, Christianity hijacked morality. It claimed ownership of something that humanity already possessed, and by doing so it chained morality to faith. But morality does not need faith. Morality needs humanity, and the world is proof, because secular societies today often show higher rates of equality, compassion, and justice than deeply religious ones. So when you are told that without Christianity there would be no morality, you must remember Hammurabi, remember the Buddha, remember the philosophers, remember the countless humans who lived moral lives long before Christianity, and see clearly that this is a lie designed to keep you afraid of leaving, because if you believe morality is tied to Christianity, then leaving Christianity feels like leaving goodness itself. But the truth is, you do not need the church to be good. You do not need the Bible to be kind. Morality belongs to humanity, not to any faith. And this brings us to the seventh lie, the most destructive of them all, the lie that faith replaces evidence, that you do not need proof because faith itself is the highest virtue, that doubting is a sin and questioning is rebellion. But is that not the very opposite of truth? Should truth not welcome questions? Should truth not stand up to evidence? And yet Christianity demands that you believe without proof, that you accept without questioning, that you replace evidence with faith. Why? Because if you asked for evidence, the system would collapse. If you demanded proof, the lies would be exposed. So, the church teaches that faith itself is good, that belief without evidence is holiness. But think about how dangerous this is. It means you can be convinced of anything. You can be manipulated into anything, as long as you are told to have faith. And that is exactly how billions have been controlled, by elevating blind belief above reason, by making faith the ultimate virtue. The church has created a system where doubt is demonized, where evidence is ignored, where truth is silenced. This is not virtue, it is control, because when you teach people that questioning is evil, you make them easy to rule, easy to manipulate, easy to exploit. And is that not exactly what history shows? People giving money to the church not because of evidence, but because of faith. People going to war not because of reason, but because of faith. People submitting to authority, not because it was just, but because they were told God willed it. Faith becomes the tool of power, not the path to truth. And that is why the seventh lie is the deadliest, because it shuts the door to truth forever. It tells you that evidence does not matter, that facts do not matter, that your mind and reason do not matter. Only obedience matters, only faith matters. And when you realize this, you see how billions have been trapped in a system that glorifies blindness and condemns sight. And the moment you open your eyes, the moment you see through this lie, the chains fall away, because you understand that truth does not fear evidence. Truth does not fear reason. Truth does not fear doubt. Truth welcomes all of these because truth is strong. It does not need censorship. It does not need suppression. It does not need blind faith. Only lies demand blind faith. And when you finally see that, you realize that Christianity has inverted the very meaning of truth, replacing it with obedience. And that is the final crushing exposure. Because when you add these lies together, the historical inaccuracy of the Bible, the questionable existence of Jesus, the fabrication of the Gospels, the myth of the resurrection, the corruption of the church, the hijacking of morality, and the glorification of blind faith, you are left with a system that looks nothing like truth and everything like control. And that realization is terrifying but also liberating, because once you see the lies, you can never again be deceived by them. And now we come to the crushing conclusion, the place where all seven lies converge into one devastating realization. Because once you have seen that the Bible is not historically accurate, that Jesus as described may never have existed, that the Gospels were not eyewitness accounts, that the resurrection is not history but myth, that the church preserved power, not truth, that morality was never theirs to give, and that faith has been exalted above evidence to keep billions blind, you stand at the edge of the greatest deception humanity has ever known, and you feel the weight of it. The billions of lives shaped, the wars fought, the wealth amassed, the kingdoms ruled, all in the name of a story that collapses under scrutiny, and you cannot help but ask yourself, if all of this was built on lies, then what is left? And the answer is both terrifying and liberating. What is left is the truth that you do not need Christianity to have meaning. You do not need the church to live morally. You do not need faith without evidence to live with purpose. You have always had the power to think, to reason, to question, but that power was hidden from you by centuries of indoctrination, because the greatest lie of all was not any single story, but the collective web that made you believe you were powerless without them. Yet here you stand, awakened, seeing the chains for what they are, and realizing that truth has been within you all along, and once you reach this point, there is no going back, because you know that the church cannot explain the contradictions. It cannot erase the missing evidence. It cannot undo the historical fabrications, and it cannot survive the demand for proof, so it demands faith. But you now see faith for what it is, a substitute for evidence, a tool of control, not a virtue. And when you see that, you are free, and freedom is the one thing the system never wanted you to have, because a free mind does not give blindly, does not obey blindly, does not submit blindly. It asks, it doubts, it seeks, and in seeking it finds truth that no pulpit, no priest, no bishop, no pope can ever take away. And that is why exposing these lies matters, not because tearing down Christianity leaves a void, but because tearing down lies clears the path for truth, and truth is always greater than myth. So as you sit with these revelations, as you feel the shock and perhaps even the fear of what this means, know this: you are not alone. Millions are awakening. Millions are questioning. Millions are walking away from the lies and finding strength not in obedience but in truth. And if you feel that spark inside you, that fire that says, I must know more, I must uncover more, then stay with us, because the journey of uncovering these lies is only beginning, and what comes next will shake you even further. So subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the full truth, because what we have exposed here is only a fraction of the lies still buried beneath centuries of control. And the more we dig, the more undeniable it becomes that the greatest story ever told was also the greatest deception ever imposed. And here is the final reflection you must carry with you. Truth is not afraid of evidence. Truth is not afraid of questions. Truth is not afraid of doubt. Only lies are. And so if a faith system demands your silence, demands your obedience, demands your unquestioning submission, then it is not truth, it is control. and control is the opposite, a freedom, so the choice is yours. Remain bound by the lies that destroy Christianity, or walk into the light of truth where no lie can ever enslave you again. The Church cannot deny these lies, because they are woven into its very fabric, and once you see them, you know, and once you know, you are forever free. So choose freedom, choose truth, and join us as we continue to uncover what they never wanted you to see. Subscribe now and never again. Let lies define your life.